Welcome to Space Matters, the Space Governance Podcast, where the Australasian Centre for Space Governance invites experts from across the Asia-Pacific region and around the world to discuss with us the most pressing issues of space governance, policy, and law. We explore the ways in which we all depend on space-based technologies for our daily lives, our national and regional needs. We're curious about the different roles that industry, academia, and government can play in defining global space infrastructure. And we investigate the influence of smaller countries and middle powers in the region on global space governance and the opportunity of greater space cooperation across the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific. The Australasian Centre for Space Governance is a not-for-profit association. We're a transdisciplinary hub bridging expertise in space law, policy, history, political and social sciences to advocate and shape perspectives on responsible space governance, ensuring that space supports well-being, prosperity, and sustainability for current and future generations across the Asia-Pacific. We acknowledge that many members of the ACSG live and work on Indigenous country. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations as knowledge holders of responsible governance of land, waters, and skies. Welcome to the Space Matters podcast. I'm Cassandra Steer, the chair of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance. And this is another episode in our mini-series that came out of the workshop we held back in 2024 that was titled Securing Australia Through Space. What does Australia need to secure and how does space help it do so? There were 8 policy papers that came out as a result of that workshop, and we've been interviewing the authors in this mini-series. And today's episode is something probably pretty unusual for most of you. I am speaking with Flight Sergeant Amy Hestermann-Crane, who is a space analyst in Australia's Space Command, but she's also a space ethicist. So she's talking us through a really beautiful, clear picture of what ethics, virtue ethics in particular, is and what a space ethicist does, why that's so necessary. And it's all based on her paper, which is titled Virtue Ethics and Australian Space Policy, Adaptability in Support of National Security. So she's really talking about why we need an ethical framework that is flexible and open to guide us on the good path when it comes to how we act in space and what it is to have space in support of our national security. I really, really appreciate her take on this, and she lays it out so clearly for us. I should add, as a disclaimer, because she works for the government, for defence, that all of her views expressed here are her personal views and don't represent official positions of the government or of defence. That said, she does a lot of work to advise defence, and we talk a little bit about what it is to work in that environment, and that in fact her role as an ethicist is taken very seriously and very much appreciated in a lot of contexts. So a lot to learn. There are 2 themes that I think are recurring in not only in this mini-series, probably across all of our podcast episodes, but very much so in this mini-series. One of them is that almost everyone has a bit of a story about how they got into a career in space that is meandering. A couple of people are exceptions to that, but most of them have done different things that then finally led them to being able to work in space as experts in the humanities. And most of them said they never thought it would be possible. So I think that's a really great takeaway for anyone who's interested in a career in space, keen on contributing to space law, policy, governance, history, ethics, archaeology, social sciences, political sciences, that there are in fact really important ways to contribute to what's going on globally. And the other recurring theme that absolutely shines through in every one of the episodes in this mini-series is just how critical space capabilities are to so many aspects of our daily lives, of our national security, our regional security. Australia's national interests is how we frame it in respect of these papers, because our focus was on Australia. But given the regional focus of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance, I think the point is also to take away just how important, how critical space-based data and capabilities are to a range of sectors and a range of regional national interests. So without further ado, welcome to the episode with Flight Sergeant Amy Hestermann-Crane. This might be one of the most unusual policy papers you've ever heard someone talk about, and it's certainly a really novel contribution to our series of policy papers. And that's because we have before us an incredible woman, Amy Hestermann-Crane, who is a space ethicist, which is probably the coolest job title I think anyone could possibly have. And I get to call myself a space lawyer. So, Amy, thank you for doing this. Thanks for speaking with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I actually think space lawyer is a pretty cool job title, so I'll be jealous of you and you can take mine.
I'll be jealous of you. Exactly. That's great. So, Amy, the first question we ask everyone is what led you to a career in space?
Yeah, so I was really lucky to always love space. I have two Trekkies as parents, and so space and sci-fi was always in our household. I always loved astronomy, and I wanted to be an astrophysicist when I was young. And then I realized that I'm really bad at maths, and I get numbers confused. So I kind of gave up on becoming a physicist because I found out maths is a key part of that. So I just kept it kind of as a passion and a hobby. And then I was really fortunate that the Air Force, the Australian Air Force, hired a amazing woman that you also know, Reverend Dr. Nikki Coleman. She became a squadron leader in the Air Force as a chaplain, but she also carried a second hat as a space ethicist. And part of her role to try and spread space and space literacy was to do a kind of a research program, a mentorship, and she would select some people across the Air Force. We would do a program, and she would take us over to present that at the International Society for Military Ethics, and that year happened to be Space Warfare back in 2019. So I was selected for that. I loved that opportunity. It was amazing, and I've kind of just fallen into it since then. Even if she wants to shake me, she can't. I've clung on to her like glue to make sure that I can keep doing a lot of the research because it's really exciting. I didn't even know space ethics was a thing before 2019, even though she's made this whole career of it. And I didn't know that Australia at the time were one of the world leaders in space ethics. So I feel it's a huge privilege to have been given this opportunity to work under basically one of the leading people in this field. And then after that, it just so happened that the Air Force decided to make an analyst team. They needed space analysts to track some things in space that were going on in terms of slightly different to what the orbital analysts do. And I got to be a lead in that. So in 2020, I became one of the first enlisted space analysts for the Air Force, and I've kind of just stuck with that since then. So it's been really it's kind of been a career of I fell into it, but I've always wanted to be where I am now. I think the problem when I was young was that you always thought you had to be good at maths to get into space, to be an engineer, to be a rocket scientist, to build satellites, to do whatever. And it wasn't really known that you could do the other important things like being a lawyer to make sure everyone's doing the right thing, or be an ethicist to also try and make sure people are doing the right thing, and different people in policy, or Dr. Alice Gorman protecting our history and doing, or Dr. Tristan Moss, who also works with you guys to do the other side of history. So one is archaeological protection, and one's just the historical protection, and moving forward and having all these kind of the human side of space. I think there's not enough knowledge of how to get into that, and if you can, it's fantastic. And I think part of our role should also be trying to help other people find the human part.
That's precisely why I went into law, because I'm terrible at maths, pretty average at science. So the humanities were always the kinds of fields that attracted me. And you basically put in a nutshell the very raison d'etre of the Centre for Space Governance, which is we're a collection of experts in the humanities for space. And the reason that I set up the centre is to fill precisely that gap in Australia. We need to have people who can help guide what is the policy framework, how can we assist government to make decisions about what to invest in, not based on which toy is more interesting or which widget does cool things, but what does Australia need? What are our national priorities? And how do we know that? Well, we need the policy framework. We need the history background, as you pointed out. We absolutely need the legal framework. We need you as an ethicist. And I love what you said about Nikki Coleman. I'm really looking forward to getting her on the podcast at some stage because, as you said, She's been one of the world's leaders in carving out the specialism of space ethics, and doing it from within defense, I think, is one of the most impactful places that you could be a space ethicist. So it's fantastic that you get to carry that on, particularly because you're actually part of Space Command now, right? Like that's where you are.
Yeah.
Do you fit under Space Command?
It wasn't Space Command when I first went into the Australian Space Operations Centre. That's where we first started. And that technically belonged to the Air Force. And in 2022, we were officially announced to become our own command, which sits under Joint Capability Command. So now we get to really focus as a tri-service. We get to bring all the specialists in from Army, Navy, Air Force to really push forward the space capability within Australia for both national security interests and also just trying to raise awareness. That's part of one of the lines of effort from Space Command is trying to educate people how critical space is, not just as a military side of the house, but just for Australia more broadly. And I really like that part of you wouldn't necessarily think that a military arms purpose or care would be to try and raise education within both government and military, but the general populace as well. They're really supportive of trying to make sure that everyone's aware of just how much we rely on space every day. So it's great. I really love space.
And do you find that when you present yourself as a space ethicist, or when you're trying to bring ethics into the discussions within Space Command or across the different services, do you find that people take you seriously? Do you find it hard to bring that into the discussion? Like, how is that?
Well, I should also say I'm an enlisted member, so I don't always get to sit in the big fancy meetings with all the big fancy people. But in terms of internally into Space Command, they're pretty good with that sort of thing. I think because of the legacy that Nikki left behind, there's more of an awareness, particularly in the command of what role an ethicist plays, and kind of accepting that part of my job is to come in and poke holes in stories and find the problem so that we can try and work it out before anything goes wrong. And I think there's a kind of a military culture anyway of that's what planning's about, right? You try and find where everything's going to go wrong first, and then you try to mitigate those issues. So I really like our legal team that's in the Space Command that we have at the moment. Well, even the ones that were there before as well seem to be really aware of the importance that they play and also the longevity of the effects that their decisions can make. So I feel valued in Space Command. I know that when I can go to other places that already don't have a huge awareness of all the different roles that space has, when you then say a space ethicist, that's usually where they're like, what even is it? But that's the fun part of getting to educate and brag about what we do. And yeah, I feel generally that they want to do what is best for the country, both now and long term. So yeah, I think as much as they can influence, they're doing their best to make sure it's a sustainable practice.
Well, they have to. And that's one of the things that you raise in your policy paper is that we need to link concerns for sustainability of the space environment with security. They're inherently linked. But before we go into that, actually, I want to ask you to give us a bit of an explanation what virtue ethics is, because you could choose any number of ethics or moral frameworks, and you really advocate for applying a virtue ethics framework both to our legislatory and regulatory environment and also to, I guess, the operational environment. So tell us in a nutshell, like lay it out for us like a 12-year-old, a smart 12-year-old, but nonetheless someone who doesn't understand what virtue ethics is.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I didn't really realize what virtue ethic was before I got told about it either. So I actually got into ethics surprisingly uh, a little bit odd. I grew up in Australia, but my family was Buddhist, so I already had a society that was more a Christian value set, and but a household that was Buddhist value set. And then when I went to university and did history, there was an ancient ethics course, so then I did that one and got really interested. And then Nikki came along and went, "Hey, do you want to apply all that historical stuff to the future?" And I said yes. So
Awesome. Yeah.
virtue ethics
Yes.
comes, as most Western ethics comes from ancient Greece, and this is from Aristotle, where he believed the key to happiness was finding the medium way. And an example that I really like to use to demonstrate it is if there is a massive 6'4" Jack Reacher style looking thug who was trying to steal a handbag off a tiny little grandma. and I am myself a 5'2" slight woman of not a lot of muscle mass, it would be it would be recklessness of me to try to go in and fight himself. But it would also be cowardice of me to just turn the other way. So the mean of that scenario between cowardice and recklessness is I can shout for help. I can call someone on the phone to start calling the police there. I can try and do other things and find that golden median to help as much as I can versus endangering myself, potentially others, or ignoring the situation and running away. Whereas if it's a 5'11" man and I am the 6'4" Jack Reacher, my golden median moves much more toward what was reckless before. I can actually go in and step in and physically try to win the handbag back for the old lady while still maybe calling attention to it or calling police or whatever. So virtue ethics really is about finding a medium between excess, sometimes called recklessness, and a lack of ethics, also called cowardice. And what that looks like is dependent on the individual to the situation. So a lot of other ethics systems like deontology or the contractualism or the utilitarianism, which is ends justify the means, they're scenario based and they kind of are more rigid in the fact that they're always meant to be done a certain way. The law is the law, regardless of where you are. And it means that virtue ethics kind of flips that on its head, where you learn your ethics and your moral values to yourself as an individual and you apply them inside that spectrum per situation, that because every situation you're going to encounter in life is different, which means it allows a lot more flexibility in something such as space, which changes so fast that if we make a law today or a technology today, in 10 years' time, it could be completely different. Or even, as I hope we eventually get to do more space exploration. When we come to planets that we have no contextual knowledge of, we can't necessarily apply our Earth-based ethics to this new environment. So if we take the virtue ethics with us, which is individual to us, we'll be able to find that golden median no matter what the situation is when we're there. So I really like it. And we can see virtue ethics already used, actually, if we go back to the law, where the law is kind of that contractualism of don't steal, or if you do steal, you will get these kind of legal sentences. But then the sentencing side of the house kind of uses that virtue ethics of finding mitigating factors. So you don't necessarily do an excess or a lack of punishment to an individual if they had a lot of other circumstances that led to it. So I quite like it because it's flexible, because it's transferable, and it's able to be updated a little bit more quickly than things necessarily such as the law or how we use technology or those sorts of things.
How can you, because that's something that you do say in the paper as well, is that we can, because it's flexible, agile, and we can update it. But how do you update a virtue ethics framework if really it's about, all moralities are about doing the right thing. It's just that you might disagree what the right thing is, depending what your moral framework is. But how is it that we update? Isn't it more that because, as you said, it's flexible and it's case by case, that means that we can respond with a bit more agility rather than updating the moral framework?
I would say it's a bit of both, because even from 20 years ago, our societal moral values have shifted a little bit. Like when I was in primary school, it was illegal for same-sex marriage, and then society managed to shift enough and the law caught up, and now it's totally fine because society has said it's fine. So in terms of that level, there's updating. When in 20 years' time, we can update our virtue ethics framework within laws a lot faster than necessarily the whole ratification process itself. When our society has shifted from something that we believe is okay today, it might not seem okay in 20 or 30 years' time. And having the virtue ethics in there means that we'll be allowed to shift towards the societal beliefs that we hold a little bit easier than if we have really, really rigid laws. But also the flexibility is if we happen to create a technology today that is used particularly with space technologies, we put something up that might be used one way, and then it's started to be used differently on the Earth. And so the laws that are in place are technically sound, but it's the way that people are using them needs to be shifted to either protect the general populace or to ensure that no one misuses the technology. Things such as GPS that went up became you could technically use that to track a lot of people if there weren't those privacy rules that were in place. So that wasn't the initial cause of it. The initial purpose of GPS was a military use to make sure that they could find their people. But as it starts to expand, and everyone has GPS on their phones, on their watches, in cars, you could misuse that if the law is still technically correct, but needing to maybe shift what initially came out around the correct use of GPS when people started to do
Yeah.
more uses of it, or the ways that imagery technology exists. So those sorts of things, the laws are still technically correct in it, but then you have to realize those privacy laws need to then start expanding of, well, now we have eyes in the sky. Where do people's privacy levels sit? So it's that would be the adaptability and flexibility to correct laws and correct social values with a technology that can now loophole some of those aspects, and that we have to adjust
Yeah.
to a new thing that comes online. So I guess really it's both.
Yeah, so it's the virtue ethics framework doesn't shift, but it helps to guide us as to when we need to shift how we're regulating or how we have certain strategies or doctrines if you're thinking about a military context. And it reminds me a bit of the discussions around space security that shifted from a multi-decade deadlock where we had a very politicized split between those countries saying, no, what we absolutely need is a binding treaty and it has to really focus on weapons based in space, and a bunch of other countries saying, no, not only do we not want a treaty, but also if we do have a treaty, it can't be around weapons based in space. It has to be around different kinds of threats. And how can you define what a weapon is when, as you said, things can be repurposed? And it just becomes this quagmire that gets stuck. And it was when there was a shift with, thanks to the UK mostly, in 2020 with a General Assembly resolution and then a whole new process that has kicked off as a result from that, where they said, let's move away from trying to define which capabilities are lawful or unlawful. Let's instead discuss what might be responsible behaviors and what might be some red line irresponsible behaviors.
Yeah.
And so I think you could probably say that is a virtual ethics framework. It's saying, let's come to some agreement about, we must be able to find some consensus about the things that are absolutely irresponsible and unacceptable. In other words, bad. And although there might be a grey area about other things about where they fall in that spectrum of responsible and irresponsible, what we're looking for is the good. And when we're talking about behaviors and we're talking about that framework, it gives us much more flexibility than if we're getting stuck into legal and technical detail, which, as you said, is just going to be outdated by the time we put it down in a document anyway. So I think that that's a really helpful explanation. Thank you. So given that, and I would think too, though, correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe even more so with respect to laws and regulation in a military context, when you're talking about doctrine and strategy and this kind of guidance documents, that in fact that's where virtue ethics framework would be particularly useful, because you're not looking for dogma, you're not looking for strict rules that always get applied, you're looking for facts are going to be changing all the time. We have to assess things on a case by case basis. Our key framework should be a virtue ethics framework. It seems to me that's actually an even more applicable environment than when talking about legislators.
Yeah, I think it's well, one of the good things I really like about our military is that we have a few key strategic and policy documents, and they seem to actually quite regularly go through them. So unlike potentially other places or other nations that might have quite long-lasting white papers or defense strategies, ours cycle through quite regularly every 2 years or so. And there'll be a national strategy and defense strategy, and they kind of overlap themselves. So we get quite a good update and refresh. But I do like to see when we read the policy and the doctrine where they have the verbiage in there that makes it that kind of that soft obligation of allowing, as you said, the virtue ethics to go in and to see the means, the words such as these things should be done under the principle of, or the guidance of, or with the intent of meeting these things, which means that, yes, they have built in a level of flexibility that, I mean, the geopolitical stage can change so fast. Like if you look at Europe
Yeah,
from
as it is
2021
right
to
now.
2022, it was a huge difference. And so we don't know how quickly
Yeah.
those sorts of things could happen. And when natural disasters happen and we need to shift focus to help our neighbors, those sorts of things can really shift. So yeah, definitely it's important. And I think you can see some of that in the policy that we have at the moment, which is I really appreciate it at being a member.
No, that's really great. So let's talk about this link you make in the paper between sustainability and
Mhm.
security, which I agree with 100%. We can't separate, quite often we hear the issues being put into three buckets, the main kind of policy and governance issues in space being seen as safety or security or sustainability. In fact, all three of them are very intertwined, but you focus quite a lot on the need to think about sustainability through a security lens, or at least to link those two. Can you talk us through that a bit more?
Yeah, definitely. As you said, I think a lot of people that work heavily in space understand that sustainability is actually a key to everything and will underpin it. If we can't use space, then it doesn't matter if it was a key to security or a key to whatever or key to economic success. Like you can't use it anymore. So that's probably the
Yeah.
the very key point is that if space doesn't exist anymore, you can't use it. So everything else you wanted doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you wanted money or security or to just watch your TV in a rural setting. You can't do that now. So that's probably the very easy, dirty way of linking sustainability to security. National security covers a whole heap of aspects. A lot of people, when they think of national security, are mainly just either thinking border security or having a defense force that can protect us, or the police force inside of Australia to defend laws and protect us from criminals. But it also goes into an education security, financial security, environmental security, a whole heap of other little elements that build a nation for prosperity and its own ability to sustain itself moving forward. And so many of the capabilities that are in space, particularly for Australia, feed into that. So we have satellites that help with our educational sustainability, providing services into either rural places or for individuals who can't go to a physical school. Uh, Obviously, the banking system relies on GPS, and a whole heap of other systems like our energy and water and a whole heap of things rely on the precise timing of GPS to keep it sustainable and to keep that working. Even though we could technically go back to an analog system, I don't think any system built now for banking or power or whatever is ready to switch within 3 days back to a purely
That's right.
analog
Okay.
system. So
People are often like, it's not that bad to go back a few years, but the point is the systems aren't set up for it anymore. We
exactly.
just,
So they'll
yeah,
break within
exactly. Yeah.
2 to 3 days, and the way to go back will take us months, if not. So we'll have this huge period of time where we don't use it. But even tying into things like environmental sustainability, we have a whole heap of satellite systems that detect when hurricanes are coming, when bushfires start, so they can mitigate. I think it's about up to 90 minutes worth of from fire detection to fireys being able to go out in rural settings
Mm,
compared to if you have to wait on line of sight. So there's a lot of
mm,
little elements that space contribute to our terrestrial national security. And in order to keep that, we have to make sure that the space environment remains sustainable and the way that we behave towards one another remains sustainable so that we can keep using those critical
mm.
systems. Because if you can't use them, they may as well not exist. So that's what I
Yeah.
really link in with the paper is why sustainability is actually the foundational thing that we need to look at, both in how we use it and how we clean it up and keep it safe, and how we interact with one another to make sure that it remains that global commons for everyone.
So clearly put. Thank you. That's really great. So you recommend in the paper that Australia should have more of a multilateral focus, and maybe that goes a bit to what you're saying about the way we behave towards each other as well in our use of space, because Australia does have a pretty multilateral
Mm.
focus in what we do in space. Obviously, the Space Agency has part of it. The legal team's job is attending the meetings on the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and the legal subcommittee there taking place in both the Space Agency and Defence and DFAT as well have people who attend these space security discussions. So, and we do obviously see a lot more growth in terms of international partnerships for industry with India, with the UK, with South Korea. Possibly, I think we could be doing a lot more with Japan. I certainly think we could be doing a lot more of a focus on Asia Pacific. But you argue we should have more of a multilateral focus. And with that, we should be incorporating a range of different values from those international partners. And I would guess, particularly if we're looking more to our Asia Pacific neighbours, what does that mean? What kind of opportunities would that provide? And why is it better than what we're doing now?
I definitely don't want to slam what we're doing now, because I think Australia is really fantastic in realizing, one, our capability that we're not a superpower in the world, so we do need to rely on others. Space is expensive and difficult. But also it seems that we're not just doing it out of a selfish means. And we can see in the last few years, as you said, we're building a lot more of those connections with South Korea. Hopefully we'll keep doing it with Japan. And then obviously our traditional allies in various European countries and America. The reason I suggest more is, one, I think it can make Australia. We've been looking at countries and getting a lot of help from said superpowers, especially among space, with being able to lift us up. And we've offered a lot of our land in terms of our ability to put tracking stations and the space surveillance stations, because Australia is in a fantastic place. We have large areas of quiet, both in terms of light pollution and in terms of radio noise. We have really quiet and really dark skies that offer scientifically beautiful area into a part of the sky that the Northern Hemisphere can't see, because obviously we're down south. But I think that there's a lot of benefit if you look at kind of a geopolitical scale, and I don't need to be convincing you of this, but the more that you can uplift other countries and lessen global poverty levels, you gain, the whole world gains. You get a whole heap of people who suddenly have more education opportunities, that have a completely different way of thinking about problem sets, that are able to invent technologies that are going to be brilliant for either just with their local area that we haven't been able to understand because we didn't live in that place, or just a brain that has an opportunity now might be the one to cure cancer in the West. And that's only because we were able to help lift up their country wherever they were. Is it in Africa? Is it in Asia? Is it wherever? It doesn't matter where. But I think we, from an ethical or moral point of view, we're quite a well-off country, especially where we sit in the Southern Hemisphere. And there's a level of, not only can we get a lot of benefit from those above us in terms of their economic powers, but we should be trying to bring those around us up as well, because then we can get a larger global benefit. We can get a regional benefit in terms of those who really like the kind of political talk. You would describe it as being a partner of choice inside the region, that we would keep having these really nice, strong connections with everyone. I'm not saying that we need to, run ourselves into the ground to make sure that everyone can have their own space launch pad, but the value that you can get from people who think differently and who see the world differently means that you might get capabilities that benefit us and our community in a way that we wouldn't have thought of and weren't prepared to create.
Yeah.
And so even though we're doing really well, obviously there's always room to improve, which is great. And if we happen to do that, particularly as you said in the Southeast Asian, Northeast Asian regions, and hopefully more in Africa as well, and with some of our countries in the Middle East as well, are really getting into space. All of these countries have very, very different value sets. The matter of fact that no matter which country you go to, we have shifted our value sets, and we have learnt, and we have adapted, and we've changed. We've changed from 50 years ago, we've changed from 100 years ago, which is good and healthy, and I think that's important that we do that. But even from my time growing up in that dual Christian schooling system versus
Value sets,
Buddhist
yeah.
household, I already saw that there were differences, some of which I liked from both sides of the fence. And I think that that's true of other countries. Just because we aren't going to take every Eastern value set, that doesn't mean they don't have some benefits there. And I don't actually know a lot about African ethical value sets and how they work and operate, but I'm sure some of them are going to be really useful for us as a society. And we might actually learn something and become better collectively. The other reason, just from a logistical side of the house, is these people also believe that their value sets are the more correct ones in how to live a healthy life and happy lives. So if we come in with any of our value sets that really heavily conflict, we're going to run into those issues of trying to make international policy because we're fighting from two different sides of the house, when foundationally we might just be able to find that medium path and move forward in a much more collective and constructive way. So it's more just a call for those who are in the privileged position of making that policy to just be cognizant that maybe our values, not all of them are the best, especially when you're looking at collective policy. There are many nations that are more community focused than we are, that there could be ideas out there that could benefit us if we're just willing to be open to it.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And in fact, the failure to do that has been the reason for failures in global space governance. I mean, not just space governance, right? Anything that requires multilateralism or international partnerships. But I'm thinking of a couple of examples, in particular, the code of conduct that the EU was an EU-led initiative, and it was all very well-meaning, and it had some great principles in there. Another attempt to have a non-binding kind of set of guidelines that we could all agree on. But one of the key reasons that it failed as a whole process was that pretty much the entire global south said this is so Eurocentric as a project. Some of the values are Eurocentric, and the process has been entirely Euro-led and Western focused. And so a lot of countries said, we haven't been included in the drafting process. Our concerns and interests haven't been included or listened to. And the EU, to its credit, said, okay, let's roll back a bit. Let's do some consultations. But the fact that they called it consultations still made it appear to a lot of stakeholders that it was very much still an EU-led initiative. And unfortunately, it completely failed because it just, no matter how well-meaning it was, just wasn't taking into account precisely what you just said about coming to the table knowing that you might have different value sets and different approaches. Sometimes that's not going to change. You might still have the same outcomes or objectives, but sometimes it might take you in a completely different direction. And that might be a good thing. Like it might take you to a solution that isn't possible from within your own framework. So I think that's really important. And I guess the piece I would add to it is that I love that you said it is morally worth our while to be lifting others up, but also that we get to benefit from it, that it is two-way, that it's not about us being some magnanimous superior country or actor, because I do think at the same time we get an enormous amount of value out of, particularly again, if we are looking to do space cooperation with countries in our region, and it ends up being a cost sharing, benefit sharing, burden sharing exercise, because as you said, space is still difficult and expensive. And we don't have to do the entire thing end to end. One country could have a bit of satellite manufacturing. One country could be doing the data processing. One country could be doing an operations piece. And what you get out of that is a capability that Australia can't build on its own, but you also shore up the region. You strengthen the region from a security perspective, because when you have that interoperability and that shared capability, now these countries don't need to turn to our other good friend China, for example, because we're building it ourselves. So you shore up the region, which is in our own interests.
Definitely. So the fact that if multiple people buy into something to send it into space, and they feel that they have a level of ownership and I guess skin in the game, so then even on the world stage, they're more likely to try to get their voices heard, and they're more likely to feel that these problems that might not have seemed to affect them suddenly do very clearly affect them as well. So you actually get more buy-in as well from the international stage, the more people that you can kind of bring in, even on the smallest possible way, and to make these policies. So it's not just the three biggest powers trying to make all of the decisions like it was way back when, and we do actually find better means forward and more people actually caring about sustainability in space.
Yeah, and particularly given, anno 2025, the global order is changing before our very eyes. And so we need to be thinking about which partners we really want to move forward with. We're coming up against time. We don't have much time left. This is wonderful and rich and fantastic. I wanted to ask you about one of your other recommendations, which is that the Australian Space Agency should have a space ethicist. Obviously, defence benefits from you. In the past, it was Nikki. In fact, Nikki, I think, spent a short time working when she was seconded out from defence into the Space Agency as a space ethicist for them. But you recommended that there should be a dedicated space ethicist in the Space Agency. What would that person's job be? Obviously, they would be complementing you from doing it from the defence side.
I think they'd have an even greater and bigger job, which would be really, really fun. Nikki has described the job as being an evil genius and then working out how to stop yourself, which I really like because it makes you just get to have a lot of fun trying to work out absolutely ridiculous things that people could do with space and trying to stop it. And unfortunately, some of the things, the ridiculous things you think of are very affordable and very easy to do. So I think the benefit of having a space ethicist within the building means that the policymakers and generally ASA would have that touch point immediately. They don't need to either go and try and find someone else. Also, they won't be able to, I guess, forget. It's really easy to go, oh, we have a lawyer here and the law is always correct and therefore it's fine. But since laws change, we know that laws sometimes aren't correct. And also, even if a law is technically correct, that doesn't mean it's currently right. And it doesn't necessarily meet the goals that we have as either a community or even as a government moving forward long term. So having the ethicist in the room to kind of challenge and to raise people's voices who aren't there, potentially raising Indigenous voices if we're wanting to move into an Indigenous community for space, raising gendered voices if it's a whole room of men, raising, diversity voices if it's a room full of just Western value-based people, and making sure that we think outside of the box, and also to bring in some of those other solutions that maybe people who are really fixated in how they do their policy or how they do the law or how they do whatever, or engineering, to bring in that human side and remind people that what we're doing is actually affecting people. So it's a really underrated but important job, and having that position that will be in there for someone specifically dedicated to make sure that the space agency is contributing their mission set the best way forward is, it might cause some fights in different boardrooms, but it means long term, I think the space agency will be able to look back at its history with a lot more pride and knowledge that they laid some really solid foundations for our future generations in space. So it would be nice if they could establish their space ethicist again, and then we could really be proud as a nation that we're not only having some individuals that are leading the way in space, such as Nikki, but that we're having organizations that are really trying to focus and lead the way as ethically sound space professionals.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it brings us back to sustainability again. I would like to highlight that there's a First Nations engagement team that's part of the Space Agency, which has done some really amazing building block work. It's been really great. And so there is an ethical piece to the puzzle there. But I think what you're saying is that is a piece to the puzzle. And then you probably need a dedicated person who can think across, well, what is Australia doing in the space security discussions in Geneva? What's it doing around the lunar resource guidelines that are being developed in Vienna? What's it doing with commercial partnerships across the region? And to really kind of have that broader perspective. So, I started off by saying that this is probably an unusual contribution to the policy paper series for most readers and listeners, but I think you've laid out really well just how necessary and important and practical it is, actually, that if we don't have this perspective, we're kind of going blindly. So I really want to thank you for the work that you do and also for your contribution with this policy paper. And for laying it out so clearly. I look forward to having you back on the podcast.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity. It was a really exciting time to be part of this.
The Space Governance Podcast is supported by research funds of the Australasian Centre for Space Governance and is produced by Amelia Taylor. You can find out more about today's guest in our show notes, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Instagram. Watch this podcast video on YouTube or listen on your favourite podcasting platform. And if you have suggestions of topics or guests that you'd like us to speak about and with, please contact us via LinkedIn, Blue Sky, or Instagram.